as of when I'm filming this, it is currently Halloween in the afternoon. We'll see if I'm able to get this up by this evening. So, first of all, I am so sorry for not posting for like 2 weeks. I've just ghosted everybody, and it hasn't been because like I haven't necessarily had time to film, because I have, and I've started to film several videos and they just didn't feel right. And so I keep scrapping the ideas for videos and just not recording anything. Like I tried to do a Halloween vlog and that went awry after like the first day. I tried to do like a Preptober vlog, that also went awry. But I do want to get back into videos, especially because it's going to be a new month tomorrow, because I'm just blabbering on at this intro of this video and you all are probably not interested about my personal life. Let's go to the books that I read in October. For those who missed my TBR for October, basically my whole idea for this month, as well as November coming up, is that I'm going to try to read more medieval books to prepare for my book that I'm writing for NaNoWriMo, which is set in a medieval-esque fantasy world. So, I had plans to read a lot more books than I actually did, but I am happy with some of the books that I did read. So I started off this month with a reread, actually, and that is The Savage Damsel and the Dwarf. Basically, I didn't realize just how much lore this fits into with Arthurian legend, because in the back, and I don't remember this because I did in fact read Le Morte d'Arthur. I read it from first to last page, but I don't remember a lot of the smaller stories that didn't feature like famous characters. But one of the characters that is featured in Le Morte d'Arthur by Sir Thomas Malory was Sir Beaumains and the Dame Lyonesse, and so this book takes that story and kind of twists it. Lynette, her beautiful older sister, is being held captive in her castle, so she goes to King Arthur's court to try to get a knight to come and defend her sister and save the castle. On the way, she meets this dwarf, and they argue but then become friends, and she gets to court, meets this man who is, spoilers, actually a knight even though he's in disguise, and they travel to save her sister. Hilarity ensues. It is more of a young YA or middle grade type book. There's a lot of things that don't necessarily go together. There is this fairy type world, which is in Le Morte d'Arthur, which is randomly put into the plot of this story, and it doesn't necessarily make sense necessarily with the rest of the story, but I still enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. I'm pretty sure when I first read it I would have given it 5 out of 5 stars, but I did enjoy it, and it was a good opener to the month. The next book I read was The Celts, from Prehistory to the Present Day by John Davies. This book is, I ended up getting this book for $1 at a thrift bookstore, and it documents kind of what we know about the Celts, and which is interesting. I feel like I'm absolutely stupid, but I thought for some reason the Celts basically originated and settled in England. Which was not necessarily the case. They were all over Europe. It just, they ended up later on focusing more on England. Basically, a lot of the books like these I'm reading just to get ideas for my book for NaNoWriMo, so I'm reading it with a purpose, which is a very different way to read something than to just read it to like absorb a story or absorb information, because when I'm reading this I'm specifically looking at like what was the life of these people like, what can I like pull from it that I can then incorporate into my story, like trade networks and how their villages were designed, things like that. So it's a different way of reading, so I don't absorb as much of just general information as I do specific information that's fitting for my story, if that makes sense. But it was a good book. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. All right, and then I read, this was actually a retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and this one I read was by Michael Morpurgo, and I have not it's been years since I've read Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. So that one, I believe, is told in poetry format, whereas this one was almost like a short story. It had absolutely beautiful art in it. I love the art, but it was basically like a prose retelling of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. Honestly, I didn't think that it added anything new to Sir Gawain and the Green Knight's story. I enjoyed it. I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. And I love the story of Sir Gawain and the Green Knight. If you didn't know the story, basically it starts off with King Arthur and Queen Guinevere in their court, and Sir Gawain is the nephew, I believe, of King Arthur, and this massive green knight who is entirely green walks into the court on Christmas Eve and is like, all right, who of you is not cowardly enough, is strong enough, is brave enough to chop off my head, and in a year's time, if I survive it, you have to let me return the blow. So basically, if he survives, you're going to be dead. And so King Arthur walks forward because he's like, no one's going to call me a coward. And Sir Gawain is like, no, I'll take your place. I'm your nephew. I will be your champion in a sense. And so he lops off the Green Knight's head, and the Green Knight just, I don't remember if he picks up his head or he just like survives it and just walks out and say, in a year's time, come and find me. So in a year's time, of course, flash forward, Sir Gawain travels to find him, and there is a lesson to be learned, a moral, as you see in a lot of the Arthurian legends. It's very steeped in Christianity and moral and the ideas of like Chaucer. I enjoyed it. I liked it. It's a good story. I have loved the Green Knight story before, and it's been a few years since I've read it. So I highly recommend reading it because it's such a quick read, and this one was a good adaptation because it was the same story basically. The next book I read was The Plantagenets, The Warrior Kings and Queens Who Made England by Dan Jones. This was actually recommended to me by one of my subscribers in the comments. One of you guys clearly give me like the best recommendations. I didn't love this book, but I really enjoyed it, and it really gave me a lot of ideas for my stories. I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. Basically, it is a nonfiction book documenting the descendants of William the Conqueror in 1066, his descendants, all the way up to, I would say, the fall of the Plantagenet line, which you probably heard of, like the Tudors and the Stuarts, War of the Roses type stuff, but you may not actually have heard of the Plantagenets. The book is very much centered around the kings and queens, the political conflicts, some of the big battles. It is written in a very engaging manner, which for the regular reader, I think they will find it easy to read than a lot of dense, dry histories, which I appreciate that a lot of historians, including Dan Jones, recently have been writing more engaging histories. So I enjoyed that aspect. Saying that, I have a feeling when it comes to history, and this is just like my personal interest in history, I don't like learning about all the political stuff, all the like wars, all the like small grabbing of power and balancing of power and like marriage and things like that. What I love about history is very much learning about the regular person, how life would be like, what types of food they would eat, things like that. That is what I'm more interested in. So I didn't like this book as well as I could have if I had been more interested in the political stuff, if that makes sense. So I enjoyed this book. It was very well written. I ended up giving it 3 out of 5 stars. If you are interested at all in I guess Game of Thrones, medieval conflict, I highly recommend this book. So the next book I picked up is the one that I picked up mostly for Halloween, and that is The Castle of Otranto by Wallace Walpole. I talked about in my TBR for October how this book is considered to be the first Gothic story. It inspired the whole genre of Gothic literature that you see predominantly in the 19th century, but you see it all the way up into the 20th century. You see the genre of Gothic romance that my mother read in like the 50s and 60s. So I was really interested in read it to kind of see where the influence came from of later Gothic type stories like Wuthering Heights, like Jane Eyre, like Frankenstein either, or Dracula. So more of the horror side, also more of like the romance type side. And I enjoyed it. It's kind of absolutely ridiculous, bonkers, over the top dramatic, but I feel like a lot of Gothic novels are. So it follows this man, this king, this medieval king, who is named Manfred, and his son just recently died. Now he has a wife, a daughter, and his son's soon-to-be wife was living with them, or at least staying with them temporarily. And after his son dies, he decides that he wants to get rid of his wife and marry his soon-to-be daughter-in-law, whose name is Isabella. And of course, Isabella is like horrified at the thought of, one, marrying a man who's already married, and also marrying the man who was the father of the guy that she was going to marry. And so, of course, she tries to escape. She seeks sanctuary in a church, and she also runs into this young man who is kind of mysterious. We learn more about him as the story goes along. And of course, there's the damsel in distress, and there's also Matilda, the daughter of Manfred, who is this very, in a sense, holy young woman. And so she's one of the main characters, and there's just so much drama going on, and the ending is just so over the top ridiculous. But it does have important lessons that you see more in medieval stories. So it's interesting how Gothic kind of, in a sense, combined kind of the medieval feel of earlier tales with more of like a modern creepiness. I don't know, it's very intriguing, and I loved the book for the descriptions of the castle, the Gothic architecture, the like suspense of what is going to happen. I can see why it became such a popular genre, even though I don't necessarily think this is the best example of that genre. And I ended up giving this 3 out of 5 stars. Now, the next one is I reread Beowulf, and I actually kind of reread it twice this month. And I have a whole rant review because I read Maria Headley's translation of it, which came out a couple years ago and was quite controversial when it came out. And I could understand in a sense what she was doing, but I absolutely hated the translation. And I have a whole rant discussion about it on my channel, which I will link down in the description. But yeah, so I love Beowulf. Beowulf is a great story. You've got like a classic hero who goes to fight monsters and defend his people. It's fun. It's a lot of fun. The next book I read was Life in a Medieval City by Edwin Benson, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Basically, it is a look at, I believe, the 13th or 14th century look at the town of York in Great Britain, and it looks at what the architecture was like, what different types of lives were like, whether the clerical or the peasant or the noble. And it is written, I believe, in the 1800s. Okay, it came out in 1920, the book. And the book is only like 100 pages. I ended up listening to it on audiobook, so it's a pretty quick book, but I read it basically for research for my book for NaNoWriMo, and I enjoyed it. It paints a very vivid picture of what that era was like, but you can also see the influence of like what Benson's preconceived notions were in 1920 that influenced what he looked at the medieval era. So it's always interesting to see all those layers of history. But it was a good book. I don't have much to say about it because, again, it was a quick book, and I was reading it specifically to kind of understand that era more for my book. All right, the next book. I'm super happy I finished this, but I also wanted to finish all of them. I finished the book 1 of the Divine Comedy by Dante, Hell. This is the translation by Dorothy L. Sayers. I actually switched back and forth between this and an audiobook version of it because I was struggling a little bit with finding time to read it. And this translation, I would say, is very accessible. The audiobook translation is slightly less so. I didn't enjoy it, and I would need to look up who the translator was because I'm not 100% sure. But for those who don't know, This book was written in the 1400s by Dante Alighieri, and he was an Italian. I think he was a nobleman, or at least he was wealthy enough. And he wrote this book as an allegory to life, I guess. And this one specifically follows Dante himself as he wakes up in this dreamlike type hell, and he meets Virgil, who is going to be his guide through hell as well as purgatory. And so he experiences and sees what hell is like. And it is very much like, you can take it as a fun adventure story and seeing it as like just enjoyable to read, but there's a lot of layers to it, and I feel like I could read this like 20 times and not fully understand it. I would need to do a lot more research on understanding what each allegory within the story kind of means, because there are many circles of hell, and as Dante and Virgil travel through those circles, they see souls who had different sins. So one of the circles that I particularly found fascinating was that of heretics, those who are Christian and claim to be practicing Christianity, but then they purposely try to lead people away from the faith. So it includes, for example, a lot of the clerical abuse that was going on, especially during that time, but even during our time, and not abuse as in the modern sense of how we think of the abuse that's going on with Catholic and Christian priests and ministers, but I'm talking abuse of like the reason Martin Luther was so fed up, where they were selling indulgences, selling graces in a sense, and you could buy your way into heaven type thing, which is not a thing. You can't do that. I wish, because that would be great if I could. So each layer of hell is different, and as you go through the story, you meet like the worst sinners. So at like the first ring of hell, they're not actually that bad. Like they had more minor sins. And then as you go further down, you see worse and worse and worse. The wrathful, the, gluttonous, things like that. And there's a lot of references both to Dante's era. He features a lot of characters that he would know either personally or who lived within the century before him. But then you also have a lot of references, as you might have guessed with the reference of Virgil as being his guide, references of ancient Greek, Roman. So you have people like Cicero and Plato, Socrates. You also have mythology, the Greek mythology. You have Cerberus. When they are traveling along, they're traveling on the river Styx, which is a reference to Greek mythology. So there's a lot of references to Greek mythology as well as references to the Italian Renaissance of Dante's era. So it is difficult to read in that sense, even though I personally think at least this translation is very easy to read. But if you don't get a lot of the references, which I had to look up several of the names, even though I would say most of the ancient Greek and Roman references, I did not get a lot of the like Italian Renaissance references. But I enjoyed this book. It was a lot of fun, but I still have Purgatory and Heaven to read, so hopefully I can read those next month. All right, and then the final book I actually finished this month. I do have two that I read part of, but the final one I finished this month is The Perfect Wife by Lindsay Sands, and I read this because I was looking for just a nice, light medieval romance, and this one was disappointing to me. So it follows Evelyn, who is this young woman who is about to get married. She is in an arranged marriage. She has not met her fiance yet, and he arrives, and they meet as they are getting married, and his name is Payne. I thought I would enjoy this book because it starts off with her being very insecure about her weight. And it's not necessarily that she's like really overweight or anything like that. She's just not super skinny, and so for years her cousins have made fun of her. So she's super insecure about herself, and I thought, okay, this is going to be a great story where it's all about, him seeing the beauty in her and her being able to accept herself. And yet that was really pushed to the side by all these disasters happening to them, and the disasters turn into like kind of a murder mystery by the end, which made no sense. And so for example, the first disaster that happens is that Evelyn's mother puts her in a corset, which they did not have corsets in the medieval era, and puts her in a corset, and so she faints during the wedding. And so of course Payne is like, oh, she's a sickly girl, because she couldn't even last the whole wedding without like fainting. And like another one is she drops a candle over on their wedding night and lights the entire room on fire, including her husband's hands, as he tries to put out the fire. And like thing after thing after thing just happens, and it's just it I feel like trumps what could have been a really interesting story of like her learning how to be a good wife and to accept herself for who she is. Like, I don't know. And he was just an awful character, because on one hand, like, yes, he has that gentle side where he's like, yes, she's absolutely beautiful, and but then he also has that manly, like, I don't understand women, and like I'm a macho dude, and the two aspects of his personality just did not go together. So yeah, I ended up giving this 1 out of 5 stars, so didn't really like it that much. I did start 2 books, or I have 2 books going currently. The first one is The Later Middle Ages by George Holmes. I actually bought this from my bookstore. I'm currently about 100 pages in, I think, and it is 200 and some pages. And yeah, it's really good. I'm enjoying it. It's a little bit dense because it gets into all the history of the later Middle Ages, but I enjoyed it. I'm enjoying it. The other one is I did read a few of Edgar Allan Poe's stories. I also read a couple of the Brothers Grimm, which was also on my TBR for last month. I read, you try to pronounce that. It's basically about this family in Hungary, and this guy finds a horse, and the horse ends up dragging him kind of to hell. It's kind of convoluted. Anyway, that was an interesting story. And then the Duke de Aumale, and that one kind of about how the Duke swindles the King of France. I don't know. The 2 stories I read for this I was not a fan of, but I did reread The Raven. In fact, I read The Raven on audiobook, technically, not reading, but I listened to an audiobook of it read by Vincent Price, and oh my gosh, Vincent Price, his voice is just so cool. He is like one of the best Edgar Allan Poe type actors. He starred in a lot of Edgar Allan Poe stories. So I did read a couple of those. I didn't read as many like Halloween-esque type things as I was hoping, but I had a pretty good reading month. But I'm curious how your reading month went. Did you read a lot of horror stuff? Mysteries? Have you read any of these books? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching, and I promise to post more in the future. And I will see you all in the next video. Bye!